Hi, and welcome to this very special edition of Voice Masters Ask Me Anything. I'm your host, James Poulter. I may also be just been your host as you're tuning in to Voice Global, or if you're watching this after the fact and that makes no sense at all, then let me let you know that I'm the CEO and co-founder of Vixen Labs and one half of the Voice Masters team with our partners at Pragmatic Digital. And today I'm joined by the two founders of that great team over in Chicago, Scot and Susan Westwater. You guys want to say hi?
Yeah, hello.
Hey, everyone.
I'm also joined by Suze Cooper, flash briefing extraordinaire and also member of my team at Vixen. Say hi, Suze.
Hi. Hi there.
And today we're also joined by a special guest voice master, and that is Colleen Fahy. I think I'm saying this correctly. She's going to correct me if I'm wrong in a minute. She's the US Managing Director of Cesium Sum. That's the tongue twister that I want you all practicing by the end of today's session. And she is going to be joining us today for this topic all around audio branding and audio inside of voice experiences. Hi, Colleen. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for inviting me. And I will just say it's Cesium Sum.
There you go. She's got it right. So if you're practicing, maybe if you're watching live, put this in the chat to make sure that you've got it right. Tell us that you're doing it well. We appreciate that. For those of you that might be joining us for the first time as part of a Voice Masters session or a Voice Masters AMA, as part of the Voice Global program today, you might not know that this is something that we do very regularly. We actually have monthly AMA sessions that you can find out more about. If you go to voicemasters.ai/AMA, that's voicemasters.ai/AMA, and you can see the videos from previous editions, as well as also sign up for our newsletter to get intro to the next edition, which we do every single month on different topics related to voice strategy, voice design, and voice marketing. So if any area of the voice program is something that you want to get introduced into, Voice Masters is a great place to do that. And we also have some additional materials that have just come out, which you can check out, which is our Voice 101 session, which is hosted by our very own Susan. And she's just going to give you a little bit of information about what that is and what the rest of the Voice Masters program is there to do.
Sure. So Voice Masters 101 for business focuses more on the who, the what, and the why. It's a primer about voice. It's not so much about conversation design as it is to just give you a really good grounding so that you can feel comfortable talking about voice and the space. And Voice Masters itself is designed to also help with that. We do go into a little bit into design, but we focus on voice strategy, and we focus on helping folks understand how to create meaningful voice experiences, be that a smart speaker or not, so that it fits within their business and helps solve problems.
Okay, and if you are hearing this for the first time, then there's a great place for you to go to get all of the additional information you need, and that is somewhere behind me here, just out of shot. It's voicemasters.ai. That's voicemasters.ai. You can find out more information about that and stay tuned to hear more about it at the end of the session. So, as I mentioned, today is one of our AMA sessions, and that means ask me anything, but you're not going to be asking me. You're mostly going to be asking them. And because this is having to be pre-recorded for our Voice Global friends, we've been taking some questions and different input from you as a community over the past couple of weeks, and we're going to be diving into a number of those topics today. But first of all, what I want to try and get to the bottom of is, what is audio branding all about? If you're just starting out in the journey of voice, this might be something that you have never thought about before. Maybe you've got brand guidelines hiding somewhere in your book, some PDF document that a strategist wrote for you a long time ago that you've not dusted off recently. But this is not what we're talking about. Audio branding is something that is lived, breathed, and heard with every experience that you engage with it. And so today we're going to talk all about audio branding and what it might mean for your business and how you can get it started. And so to do that, what I want to do is turn to our guest master, Colleen, who's on the line. And Colleen, just tell us, where are you dialing in from, other than the lovely library of books that you've got behind you? I can't tell.
I'm in Chicago. I'm in Old Town in downtown Chicago.
Excellent. And Colleen, if you were in Old Town Chicago today and I was hearing some audio branding playing, what is it that I'm hearing? Maybe just describe to us what you guys mean about audio branding.
Well, you might be listening to a podcast, and it might have a very specific voice. It would have an intro and an outro like a TV station does, like NBC. Well, maybe you have a better one in Britain. But it would have transitional sounds that would be very specific to your audio universe. So essentially it would be your voice, your music, and your sounds that create a universe that inform a whole world of sound around your brand. It might be the same voice that you would hear in your on hold music, and it might be the same audio that you would hear at the end of one of your branded content videos, or it would be a ringtone. Anyway, it would all connect, just like your visual branding does.
Excellent. So you mentioned three really interesting points there, which we're going to kind of dive into separately from the questions we've had, which is your voice. And we'll get into what we mean by a voice in a minute, because that I'm sure means many different things. You mentioned your music and your sounds, which I think is really interesting. Most of us I think when we think of audio branding, you mentioned the NBC jingle, or say, I'm loving it, or we all know these little tunes, these little jingles. If anyone's tuning in from, say, a radio background or television or broadcast, maybe these things are familiar. Do you see many brands now thinking, though, beyond those obvious places where sonic branding, audio branding is going to show up? What types of campaigns and projects are people thinking about right now when it comes to audio branding?
It's getting to be more and more prevalent. In the United States, it seemed it was a little behind Europe. Europe was already using a lot of audio brands, and I think it's because Europe speaks so many languages that having a universal language of music was very helpful to them. And in the United States, it's really picking up steam now. We've just finished doing a big brand for an insurance company. It's USAA is the logo, but that's just the tip of the iceberg. It's really a whole audio DNA that we create from which the logo emerges. And then the music is applied to their telephone on hold, their meetings and events, everything around the big circle of customer and employee experiences. So the part of audio branding that is really emerging is the voice part now, as people are interacting with brands much more through voice. And so we're seeing more clients come to us and ask us to help them choose their voices. For instance, one is somebody who makes headphones, and a voice talks right into your head, and they want it to be the right voice with the right sounds and the right quality, feeling of quality and heritage. And another is a bank, another in Canada, and another is an airline who want to identify the voice that will be the voice of their brand, as well as the music and the sounds.
Absolutely. And so thinking about all of these different elements as they kind of come together, and Scott and Susan, maybe you can elaborate on this for a little bit from more the voice technical side of things and from a strategy perspective. How are you seeing people begin to take some of these elements that Killian's talking about? So she mentioned voices, music, and audio branding elements, or sonic sounds,
cues, signals,
beds, transition sounds. How do these things begin to show up in voice activations that many of us might know, things like voice apps and skills?
Well, I think the biggest thing to recognize is with screenless experiences, you don't have the opportunity to rely solely on a logo. So visual identity is kind of really hard to convey when there's no screen. So it's incredibly important to not only have your visual identity, but also an audio identity. And so I think in these early days, what we're seeing is a lot of people applying sonic logos and having that kind of thing show up in their voice experience. People that get a little bit more advanced are definitely having the audio cues, a skill that Susan and I just worked on. We actually have opening cues, positive cue when there's an answer for a question, something where it's maybe gives you that cue that we don't have the answer for you, just to kind of reinforce the experience and actually plus it up. So it's much like adding in animation to either a website or some of the other visual mediums that we have, where it really just polishes everything up and makes it feel that much better. That's really what we're talking about when we apply audio branding and sonic branding to voice experiences, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, absolutely. It definitely makes it so that it's a richer experience, but it also then is that connective tissue because also in a conversational experience, you can't just monologue about what you stand for or who you are. So you have to convey that in very similar ways that sort of trigger why we like a person. So you have to have that voice, you have to have those sounds that then help convey that, the warmth or the intelligence or those types of pieces.
I can get myself off of my mute. That'll be fine. There should be a button that in Zoom that tells you when you're muted. I think that's the audio cue for a mute button. I think would be the obvious thing. We use these audio identifiers that you mentioned there, like transition sounds. Scott was just talking there about kind of positive and negative. These aren't anything new. Suze, I'm going to come to you because you've got a great background in radio and worked in kind of audio journalism in the past. What are the types of things that a typical radio program that you would usually have to kind of do those kind of jobs of moving you through a show? Is there anything in there that we can learn from that medium to bring into our voice experiences?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, every radio station that you listen to has got an ident, and that's basically the identity of the station. That's kind of their mainstay that will have all of those audio elements that you will recognise. So the local station here very much has a different tone for each letter of its name, and whenever you hear those 4 tones together, you instantly think of that brand. So it's about taking that, using it top of the hour, which is where they would sort of restart the programme after the news, if you like, and you'll then hear elements of those exact same audio ideas, sort of a smattering of them throughout the whole of the broadcast, and that will be through beds, through sweepers, and these are all just kind of fancy words really for different elements that are used to gel that show and that program together. So a presenter may well have their very own set of these idents, but they will still have very much that same idea. So they will fit into the full-on brand identity, but that presenter will have their own kind of version of them. And certainly on the BBC, we hear that, Radio 2, various different presenters from Steve Wright to Simon Mayo will have their own palette. Simon Mayo as was obviously, but will have their own palette of these different elements. So, audio branding is nothing new. Certainly radio's been using it for a very, very long time. But what is new really is the different places that we're hearing it now. And as Colleen was saying, as we started this, it's about tying all those elements together as a brand or a business, and ensuring that when someone hears about your brand or business, they hear about it, but they also hear those sounds in the same way to tie it all together and to remind them that it's you that they're listening to.
And what you're saying, Suze, about it being a palette is perfect, because really the music can add the color. So it's as if the voice is more like the words and the music adds the colors. And that's what makes it so emotional and memorable.
Absolutely. And I do think about it like that. In a logo or in any kind of branding, you will have your brand colours, and you might take various hues and tints of those colours, but you will stick to those colours. And equally, you might choose various sounds. You will stick to those sounds, but you might have them coming in at different times or at different pitches, different levels, and you might weave them into various different ways of being heard, but they will essentially still give you that idea, that logo that you can hear.
We're seeing a lot in voice apps and in kind of voice content experiences for smart speakers and voice assistants. People beginning to use some of these elements, some of these audio cues. I think particularly of some of the examples we've seen here in the UK, the BBC have done a lot of work in their voice design, particularly for things like their kids apps and others, to really bring to life what you're listening to. Colleen, for you, how important is it that we have these kind of audio identifiers specifically in the voice, the interactive voice medium, to kind of differentiate from the system that you're living in the rest of the time?
It's more important, I think, in the voice world than anywhere else, because you have no help from your colors, your typeface, and your logos, your packaging. It's all audio. And if you are vanilla, you will sound like everybody else. So you need a voice that breaks through and catches attention. You need a voice that is about the archetype that you want to be. And you need the other help from signals and music to infuse meaning where you can't get it through visuals. So it's extremely important.
So I want to talk about some of those other elements, because you've mentioned a lot about, you know, audio, sounds and jingles, and obviously that's incredibly important. But when it comes to, you know, voices, you mentioned the voice of a brand. Have you got any examples where, you know, we actually begin to see people really, you know, using a real voice of someone to take on that brand, to be their identifier? And what are some of the, maybe the worries about that, the pitfalls, or, you know, what are the advantages?
We have seen people beginning to take on voices for their brands. And the way you can reduce your worries is by going through a very good process. Like, first, talking about the archetype, starting with the archetype exercise to find out what kind of person do we want this brand to feel like. Is it a mentor? Is it a mother? Is it a jester? You know, you don't have to stick with those archetypes, but it's very good to get the conversation rolling. And then picking a voice that has some kind of a distinctive characteristic, and then picking an interpretation that has humanity and pauses and warmth, or whatever you're trying to say. Maybe it's not warmth, maybe you're trying to say precision, you know. But so you really put a lot of thought into the selection of the strategy behind the selection of the voice before you actually pick a voice and run with it in your advertising and your messages that say, this is off, this is on, this is waiting, this is connecting, you know, that kind of thing.
And I think it's really important as well that when you're coming from the other side of it as a voiceover who's recorded for brands and tried to vocalize what it is that they want to put into their brand sound, that can be actually quite hard from this side. So I think it's really important, if you are thinking about employing voice artists to actually be the voice of your brand, that you make sure you communicate properly what Colleen is saying. You know, that the archetypes idea is amazing, because there are general ideas that you can both work with and work on. But I've certainly received scripts before, and I've put this example out there before, where I've literally been given the script and told to make it sound shiny. And as a voiceover artist, that's really hard, because I'm not completely sure what you mean by shiny, whether we're both talking about the same sort of shiny, whether you want me bubbly and polished, or whether you want it with a certain edge to it, or are you talking a more metallic, robotic type of talking,
or elegant, like diamonds.
So I think it's really important that if you're going to be looking for that voice, that you have that conversation, and that actually is a conversation, and perhaps not just an email, that you can really align on what it is that you're looking for, because it's important. This is the representation of your brand. This is how people are going to hear you. So I think it's just so important to get that right. And there's even, you know, the idea that you might add a voice note to your script to explain how you want something said. Perhaps the intonation's a certain way. Perhaps there's a difficult pronunciation in there, or a word that you particularly want said a certain way. It's so easy now to record into our phones and send that off as a quick MP3 attachment, and I love getting that as a voiceover artist. When there's a script with some attachments to it, that means that person really cares about how this comes across and how it sounds. So yeah, all of those little things can really make such a difference to the end result of how your brand sounds, I think.
Yeah, and I think it's important to remember too that when we're talking about voice and tone, we're talking literal. You know, in the ad world, we talk a lot about voice and tone, and it's these beautiful licenses to get creative, which doesn't mean you're not going to be creative, but thinking about voice as sort of the sound and then tone as the reaction, or how that is an important thing to think through too, because there are times where as you're helping your voice talent understand, it's a serious topic. So perhaps shiny isn't really what you want, even though the heart of it is sort of this polished, there needs to be a little more empathy here, or you know that in this particular situation, the emotion of the participant is going to be extremely excitable and happy. All right, well then let's figure out how we can make sure that the directions come through and are captured. And all that should be fed into your tone of not just your word choice, but also how it's presented and said.
Yeah, and in terms of word choice, there's also a lot to be said for the fact that certainly if you're creating an Alexa skill or something like that, some of that script is going to be functional. And so you need to highlight to your voiceover where, you know, this absolutely has to be said in this way. There's no ad-libbing. There may be room for a bit more of your character to come through elsewhere, but when it comes to telling people what the invocation is, or to handing off to what the answer will be for the next level, the next section of the skill to kick in, you know, your device needs to hear a certain response. So as the voice of that skill, you need to make sure that you get those bits of functional script out properly. So as the script writer, you need to make sure that your voiceover knows that.
Now, Susan and I have had this debate a couple of times on a couple of recent projects where we've been thinking about not just voice for branding and for those navigational elements, but when you also need to use voices for content as part of an experience. And the debate we've been having is around a voice over artist and a voice actor. And Suze will, I'm sure, confirm to me that these can be two very different categories of people. Suze, maybe just give me what your thoughts on these kind of two different categories, and then Colleen, I'd love to hear your response to this and how you guys work with this at Cesium.
Yeah, so, and I think these are two very fluid terms actually, and I'm not entirely sure that everybody understands them in the same way. But as a voiceover, I would say I use my voice. Now, my voice is a very estuary, South London, boring toned UK voice that actually people in the UK don't really.
Never sees.
But that, you know, I've lost the thread now.
It's a great voice.
Yes.
And some people might want it. But
yeah, so from what I understand of it, my understanding as a voiceover artist is that I use the voice that I've got. I can't do different accents. I'm not an actor, so I'm in no way someone who's drama school trained or anything like that. My voice is, I know what my voice is good for. It's good for tutorials. It's good for instructing. I've been a newsreader for very, very many years, so it's all about getting information across in a very succinct way. But when it comes to wanting an accent or a different sort of vibe, any kind of dramatization, you know, I'd be useless on The Archers, let's say. I'm not an actor. So there's very much a differentiation between a voiceover artist who would use their own voice and a voiceover actor who might be able to put on a different voice to the one that they've got. What do you think, Colleen? Is that something that you
I think that you're making a distinction I had never thought of, but if I were going to have to do a storytelling narrative, a television commercial, for instance, or a film, a piece of branded content, I would probably be looking for someone who had acting training, who could pretend that she was a sister of this girl and she couldn't wait to tell her something or whatever. Whereas if I were delivering good straight content, then I'd want somebody with the energy in her voice. And I've used that kind of actor for instance, for pharmaceutical information that they have to give to patients, for instance. So I never thought of it as a distinction. I just look for certain properties when I'm choosing the voice for that brand, depending on the needs of that brand.
Well, and I've got a great example. So I've worked with Tom Kane before, and Tom is actually one of the foremost voice actors in the world. He does the voice for the father in Powerpuff Girls. He's the announcer voice you've probably heard in thousands of commercials. He's also the voice of Yoda and C-3PO in the Clone Wars. And so he's got such a dynamic range. He does an incredible Morgan Freeman. And actually, if you've ever seen Robot Chicken use Morgan Freeman, it's actually him doing it. And it's uncanny because like literally we did the first take with him. He goes, "How was that?" And we're like, "That was pretty good." He goes, "Do you want to do another just because you got me for 4 hours?" Or like, Yeah, I guess. But literally in that first take, he had just nailed it because he was able to go into that announcer voice and just own it. So I think that's a really good example of kind of the differences between what you're talking about, Susan.
Well, I think also there was a lot of really good direction
Yeah.
that he knew he needed an announcer voice that was an archetype that made it possible for him to get it on the first take. And that's something we should think about too, is giving that direction to even, you can have the best voice actor in the world, but if you don't give them the right direction, they may not be able to nail it on the first take.
Right.
Absolutely.
True enough.
Colleen, I wonder if you have a perspective on this. And so a couple of weeks ago, or last week, I was having a really good discussion on a LinkedIn video with a couple of folks around this whole point of how do we make sure that our voice design is both inclusive and also diverse. And there's a big kind of issue. And we're obviously speaking into a time right now where this is such a pertinent point. And you guys have seen that very much. They're in the heart of Chicago right now. We're seeing this in London. How do you think about choosing different voices for these different projects? And have you had any opportunities or instances where that's called for having to think about some of these issues in design as well? How do we make sure that we're picking the right voices for the right subjects and making sure that we don't just always default back to the obvious choices? Scott mentions one of those kind of famous voices that many people would go to. Obviously Tom's brilliant, does a lot of really good work, but there has been a trap where some of the very best voice actors just get to do all of the stuff because they're able to just do everything. How do we make sure that we're picking a wide variety of voices so that actually all the brands don't end up sounding the same?
I've been thinking about this a lot, and I sometimes think that one way to do it is to, instead of have one voice for a brand, is to at least have two. So it sounds like there's a relationship going on behind, that there's some friendship going on. And you can have a small cast too. But it gets a little bit confusing in the branding world unless you have big budgets to continue to do that. I feel as if every brand can benefit by having something that stands out, a voice that stands out. And if that's because it's a different voice that you've never heard, or a different accent or a different way of speaking the language, that the brand will benefit by standing out, by just being different. We're right now doing an Arabic voice, and there's so many ways to speak Arabic. So you have to find your way through to the one that's the most understandable and acceptable. But I think that variety in voices is going to be more prevalent.
Yeah, because this is something that's often lobbied back at using the built-in Alexa voices, is that
Right.
Even with 27 or something poly voices I think we're at the moment, or the 6 or 7 kind of good voices within Google's framework, that essentially even if you mix up those enough and change the SSML enough and all these things, you might kind of get something that sounds roughly unique, but you're ultimately still using one of 27 different voices,
No,
or
it's terrible.
in most cases the voice of Alexa, which all of us know. We'll see you again for another AMA in the coming months. We hope that you enjoyed the rest of the Voice Global schedule, and now I'm going to hand back to Pete and myself for the rest of the day. Thanks so much for joining us, and thanks so much to the team for being online.